Hi friends, welcome back to another video. If you can already tell by the title, this is going to be a book haul, just all of the books that I've acquired in the last several months, basically all the books since my previous book haul. Now I have a little bit of like guilt and shame about how many books I have to talk about, mostly because my inner minimalist self, the person who doesn't want to have excess unnecessary things in my home, feels a little bit guilty because I have already so many books that I need to read that why am I getting more? But I didn't really spend that much money on really any of these because they were either purchased from the library like store area that's like 50 cents a book or are from little free libraries. A few were purchased, but I buy like 5 books a year usually. Maybe more. Everything else is usually really cheap or free. So that's my like little justification. But I do need to read more books that I have. But today I have about 30 books to talk about. I'll go through them briefly. The majority of these are historical fiction, which I'm psyched about because that's my favorite genres. I roughly broke them down into genres. So I'll start with thrillers, which I only have one to talk about, and that is One by One by Ruth Ware. This book was 50 cents at the library, brand new, perfect condition. I've never read a Ruth Ware. I'm honestly coming into this very skeptical. I think this is a pretty low rated book in the thriller world. People who do read a lot of thrillers, I know has like an unreliable narrator, which I'm not totally psyched about. I have low expectations from this book, but for some reason I just couldn't pass it up because it was so cheap. We'll see when I read it. It does feel very wintry, so maybe in the next couple months I'll pick it up. A pretty beat up book that I found in a little free library. It's like all ripped and pretty water damaged inside and stiff, but again, I don't really care because it was free. State of Wonder by Anne Patchett. Also have never read from this author. Want to because she's quite popular. I think The Dutch House is one of her more popular ones. This is technically a like contemporary book club chick lit, I think, kind of book, but it does feel historical at the same time. This one's about a research scientist who is sent to the Amazon in South America to find her colleague who's gone missing or something along those lines. They're trying to find a very valuable ingredient for a new drug. It just sounds like an interesting and fun like adventure story, so we'll see. Then I'll knock out these 3 children's classics. The first one I picked up was the 6th book of the Nancy Drew mystery stories, The Secret of Redgate Farm by Caroline Keene. I'm actually listening to all of these books on audio. I finished the 5th book several months ago, just kind of slowly making my way through the Nancy Drew series. They're very like lighthearted little mysteries. Again, a children's book, so nothing crazy happens, but it's fun. And this was like brand new, perfect, again at a little free library. I probably won't keep it. I don't really have any interest in like collecting all of the Nancy Drew books, but I figured I'd read it, listen to it, and then once I'm done, pass this along. And then I found this really cute edition of Heidi. Really cute little illustration. I've never read Heidi, but like the sweet illustrations in this book were really cute. One of my friends mentioned that this is one of the more boring stories in comparison to like Anne of Green Gables or The Secret Garden, but I still want to read it and it's really cute, so maybe I'll keep this around for like a future child someday. And then I found this really pretty edition of Peter Pan, illustrated version. It's like this gorgeous illustrated picture book. The art style in here reminds me of a little bit of like Art Nouveau, which is one of my favorite artistic styles. I first discovered that art style in Prague in some of my travels and fell in love with it, and I just thought this was like a gorgeous illustrated children's books. So very lucky find. I feel like this one will be cute again for future children. And speaking of which, I'm going to move into nonfiction, and I promise I am not pregnant, but the best baby name book in the whole wide world. My husband and I love to talk about what we'll name our future kids. We have like a list going. It's just like this joke between us. We're quite a long ways off before, you know, that's gonna happen. If it happens, whatever, but I just, you know, wanted to read through and have like a conversation about some of these. And this book has a bunch of names listed and then just like a quick phrase of what that name actually means. Gloria, Latin for glory. Glory, Gloriana, Glorianne, Glory. So it has like different versions of that name. And then my husband's name, Brendan, is Irish Gaelic and it means little raven, and it has different like spellings of it. I just thought it's really fun. Along the same lines, bringing up Bebe by Pamela Druckerman. I don't know where I first saw this book, but I like the little blurb on the back of this book. The author, who's an American journalist, had a baby in Paris and she didn't really care to be a French parent. But then she noticed that French children sleep through the night at 2 or 3 months old. They eat braised leeks and their parents sip coffee while their kids play by themselves. And French kids are still boisterous, curious, and creative. Why? So the author noticed, you know, different differences in French parenting and the way parents in France interact with their kids and the way their kids responded, as opposed to maybe like some American traditions of raising children. I'm not French at all, but I just thought that this would be like a fun read. My husband Brendan and I like to read these like nonfiction books out loud together, hoping to learn something from them. In a birthday blog, my husband picked up this book, which is Solve Your Child's Sleep Problems by Richard Ferber. We don't have a child or one with sleep problems, but again, we like to read these like research-based things, and I'm sure this is stuff that we're gonna have questions about at some point when we have kids. We like to read books out loud together before bed. We loved reading Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker, and this is a book again about sleep, but for your child, which is interesting, maybe. So we'll see if we gain some insight and knowledge from this, even though we don't have kids yet. Another book that my husband picked up from a little free library that's now on our shelves that I want to get rid of because I don't think he'll ever read it, because he doesn't really like to read that many books, and I won't ever read it. And it's Listen Carefully, as our menu has recently changed. Musings of a Baby Boomer Living in a Millennial World by Roger Dale Loring. Basically, this is supposed to be like a humorous, you know, take on random things from a baby boomer living in a millennial world. Will we ever read this? I'm pretty sure we won't. A few more nonfictions. I picked up No One Is Too Small to Make a Difference by Greta Thunberg. This is a tiny, tiny little book with very big letters, so it would be really easy to read this in one sitting. Greta Thunberg is a climate change activist, one of the youngest. I want to say she's like 10 or 12 years old or something along those lines, and this is kind of like her manifesto. This one sounded really good. I found also in a little free library A Long Way Gone, Memoirs of a Boy Soldier by Ishmael Bea. It says here that Ishmael Bea was born in Sierra Leone in 1980, and he was a boy soldier that was trained and committed a lot of terrible acts and just wanted to escape and get away from that, and it's his story. Sounds really hard, but also very interesting. I then found Prague Winter, A Personal Story of Remembrance and War, 1937 to 1948 by Madeleine Albright. In this book, the author recounts her family's history being in Prague and how the war affected that city. And having visited the city and been to a few museums in the city, I would like to know more about how World War II kind of shaped Prague. There's even some images in here. I'm curious if it'll be more narrative nonfiction or more just kind of like straight history, but I picked it up, so we'll see. Another World War II nonfiction is Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand, a World War II story of survival, resilience, and redemption. This one is a very popular one, I think similar to Wild by Cheryl Strayed. There was a movie about it, so a lot more people are aware of this story because of the movie. But it is about Louis Zamperini, and he was a prisoner of war in Japan, and it's his struggle with like PTSD, surviving the war, and then ultimately a story of forgiveness and I think finding faith. I feel like faith plays a role in the story. I can't quite remember, but either way, I do want to read it someday. Then I have I'll Be Gone in the Dark, One Woman's Obsessive Search for the Golden State Killer by Michelle McNamara. This book is like a true crime thriller following the man who was the Golden State Killer, who committed a lot of atrocious acts in California but then was never apprehended and like disappeared, and no one ever found him or anything. And the author decided to like scour through police reports and evidence and eventually I think uncover who he was and what he did. Sounds kind of creepy but cool and interesting. And I think I'm realizing that I do really like journalistic nonfiction as like a niche in that genre. And finally, I have Live No Lies by John Mark Comer, Recognize and Resist the Three Enemies That Sabotage Your Peace. This is a Christian nonfiction, and the author is actually the pastor of Bridgetown Church here in Portland, Oregon, which is the church that I attend. And this book is all about fighting the world, the flesh, and the devil, which are the three main like adversaries that affect Christian living today. This book particularly lays out a lot of spiritual practices that you can incorporate to resist those temptations and resist believing those lies. We did have a whole teaching series on this at church, and he pretty much word for word preaches and then puts it to a book. So I will know the majority of what this book covers, but it doesn't hurt to have a refresher, you know? And his books are always so pretty. This is such like a cool cover design, and it's hardcover with no dust jacket, which is the best. Okay friends, time for this huge pile of historical fiction. The first one is My Notorious Life by Kate Manning. This book follows Axie Molden, who is the fiery daughter of impoverished Irish immigrants in 1860s New York City. She's forcibly separated from her mother and siblings and sent west on an orphan train. Which, by the way, I do need to read that book. Determined to reunite with her family, she makes her way back to New York, where she's apprenticed to a doctor, falls for the irresistible Charlie Jones, and develops a thriving midwifery practice, flouting convention and defying the law in order to help many desperate women. So a historical fiction, possibly a love story, but this book also has some feminist undertones with her pursuing being a doctor and kind of standing out in her time period and in her lifetime. Sounds quite interesting, and I've never heard anyone mention this book before. Then I have A Terribly Damaged Codename Helene by Ariel Lawhon. I really want to read from this author. I heard this book was great. I also heard I Was Anastasia was great, but I really want to read from this author and see how I feel about her writing. This book is set in 1936 and it follows an Australian expat living in Paris. She has bluffed her way into a reporting job for a Hearst newspaper when she meets a wealthy French industrialist. No sooner does Henry sweep Nancy off her feet and convince her to become his wife than the Germans invade France and she takes yet another name, a code name. And then Nancy rises to be one of the most powerful leaders in the French resistance. You know, it just sounds like your usual World War II historical fiction, but I'm curious about this author and her writing. I have another book that I've heard no one talk about, but sounds really good. City of Shadows by Ariana Franklin, a novel of suspense. This book is set in 1922 Berlin, and it's sort of like a retelling of Anastasia, the movie, where there's a guy who has a scheme to pass a young asylum patient off as Anastasia, who is the lost princess of the Romanov family in Russia. So this is historical, it's a little bit mysterious and eerie, and it has elements of Russia to it. Sounds good. Another Booker Prize winner that I've also heard no one talk about is The Narrow Road to the Deep North by Richard Flanagan. This book is set in present-day Australia as well as going back to a Japanese prisoner of war camp. It follows a man and his fellow prisoners. It says this savagely beautiful novel tells a story of many forms of love and death, of war and truth, as one man comes of age, prospers, only to discover all that he has lost. Sounds sad but interesting, and I like that it is a war story but from a different perspective. A book I bought for a future video is The Murmur of Bees by Sofia Segovia. I'm reading this for my next installment of reading books with bees on the cover or in the title. I've seen this book talked about a little bit. It seems more of a literary, almost magical realism story instead of a proper historical fiction, although it is historical. It is set in 1918 in Mexico. This book follows a family in a small town in Mexico, and they find a boy who's covered in bees, and he has this like connection with bees. I'm not sure if he has like a magical sense of like seeing the future or envisioning what's to come, but he does have like something like that going on. But they raise him, take care of him, and this is also set during the Spanish flu in 1918, so I'm sure there's also some elements of like tragedy and loss and death in it. I'm not totally sure, but I'm excited to read it, so stay tuned for that video sometime in the future. Another book I bought for that same bee video is The Beekeeper's Promise by Fiona Valpy. This is a historical fiction set during World War II. Also dual timelines. It's about a younger woman in France who gets a job in this chateau, and then she is listening to the story of this older woman recounting her past during the war and her time of love and loss and what she got up to during the war, which is also being in the French resistance. So dual timeline, World War II, France, something about bees, which is exciting. Next up, The German Girl by Armando Lucas Correa, also set during World War II in Berlin on SS St. Louis, which is a transatlantic liner offering Jews safe passage out of Germany to Havana. It also has dual timelines. I'm sure that it is going to be tragic as well. This might be one of those like mediocre historical fictions because it's rated less than 4 stars. We'll see. A classic historical fiction that I picked up is Girl with a Pearl Earring by Tracy Chevalier. I'm quite hesitant about this one. I don't fully love like stories that have to do with art. I feel like I don't totally care, and this whole book is about a painting, but the main reason why I picked it up is because I do want to do a whole vlog of reading like the most top popular historical fictions of all time, this being one of them. So I hope to get to this someday, but I don't think I'm gonna love it. I'm already predicting that. I guess pretty much almost all of these books are World War II. This one being another one, All the Flowers in Paris by Sarah Gio. I haven't heard this author. I've heard no one talk about it. It might be dual timeline. It's also set in Nazi-occupied Paris, and there's 2 main characters. One wakes up in a Paris hospital and has no memory of her past, and she's confused with what's happened in the last several years. And then another woman is working in Paris, and when Germans discover her Jewish ancestry, she's forced to flee. Again, your typical World War II historical fiction. We'll see how this one fares amongst them all. And finally, The Book of Longings by Sue Monk Kidd. I now have a few books by Sue Monk Kidd on my shelves that I need to read. This one is a bit interesting interesting though. It's set in biblical times while Jesus was alive, and it says that the author takes an audacious approach to history to imagine the story of a young woman named Anna. Raised in a wealthy family with ties to the ruler of Galilee, she is rebellious and ambitious with a brilliant mind and a daring spirit. She engages in furtive scholarly pursuits and writes narratives about neglected and silenced women. Anna is expected to marry an older widower, a prospect that horrifies her. An encounter with 18-year-old Jesus changes everything. Their marriage evolves with love and conflict, humor and pathos in Nazareth, where Anna makes a home with Jesus, his brothers, and their mother Mary. So it's about Jesus's wife and if he married and what that looked like, and it's about this woman who was like a feminist in Jesus's time. Now I'm not trying to be like controversial and say that Jesus was married or whatever. This isn't like a Da Vinci Code conspiracy theory thing. I'm not totally sure if like reading this is blasphemous, you know, if you read the Bible regularly or whatever, but it just sounds really interesting and yeah, imaginative. So, you know, why not? We'll see. And finally, before I end, I'm going to go through this stack really quickly. All of these in this stack I've hauled in my previous 2 vlogs, so go watch those if you want more detailed kind of synopsis or thoughts on them, but I'm just going to show the title. So the first one, As Bright as Heaven by Susan Meisner, historical fiction. Glory Over Everything by Kathleen Grissom. This is a sequel. Thanks, Krista, for letting me know. I do want to read the first book too before I get to this one, which is The Kitchen House, also historical fiction. The Diving Bell and the Butterfly by Jean Dominique Bobby, a memoir. Dreams from My Father by Barack Obama, another memoir. Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, a literary contemporary. Truly Madly Guilty by Leanne Moriarty, like chick lit contemporary. Gilead by Marilyn Robinson, a literary contemporary. The Sympathizer by Viet Thanh Nguyen, a literary book winner of the Pulitzer Prize. There There by Tommy Orange, a literary contemporary. The Invention of Wings by Sue Monk Kidd, historical fiction, maybe literary. Inside the O'Briens by Lisa Genova, also a contemporary. And finally, Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, a classic historical fiction. So those are all my books. I'm not allowed to acquire any more. Let me know if you've loved any of those, if you want to buddy read any of those. I feel like I need a little bit of accountability and, you know, pressure to read some of these with someone would be fun. But yeah, now I can remove these piles I had on the floor for this video and actually add these books to my shelves and get to reading them. Thanks so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys in another one soon. Bye!